good morning, everyone. Before we begin today's topic, I have just a couple of announcements. First, remember that there will gonna be a quiz on June 16th, which is Tuesday. Make sure you review all the materials we've covered so far. Mostly we're gonna have quizzes from elasticities and also like market equilibrium. So yeah, you will definitely see this today's class again later in the course as well. So like try to like go all over the like course materials and get ready for the quiz as well. And second, your midterm score should be posted by Friday. So keep an eye on the grade book. And if you have any questions about the course or, like about the grades or any concerns, please don't be hesitate. Like, try to reach out on me like as soon as possible. I'll be happy to help you out. Yeah. So, like over the last few classes, we've talked about markets and supply and demand, also equilibrium and how prices coordinate economic activities, right? So we learned that when price changes, like there would be quantity demanded change as well. So we know the direction of the change from the low of demand and low of supply, such as that. Today we're gonna move on to, like slightly different question. So let's start. So like low of demand told us like, what direction quantity demanded moves. So now we're gonna move on to elasticity, and elasticity tells us how much quantity demanded moves. And this will gonna be like super interesting. So let's start with the simple questions. So, like, suppose like this price of coffee increased by 10%, like random, amount. Will people stop buying coffee entirely? I don't think so, right? Probably not. So, like, now suppose like the price of like coffee decreases by 10%. Like, would some people decide buy more? Probably. So like we're gonna talking about like how much like quantity demanded will gonna change. So like the law of demand definitely will gonna work, but like now we're interested in like like the amount of like decrease or increase. That's exactly what elasticity measures. So let's go for it. So elasticity is a measure of like responsiveness. So it tells us like how strongly buyers or sellers react when some conditions change. So, like today, we're focusing on the price elasticity of demand, and we're gonna move on to like elasticity of like supply next class. So, like the definition of like elasticity, I just like talked, like it measures of like how much buyers and sellers respond to like, changes in the market condition, right? So like it tells us like how strongly buyers or sellers react when the condition change. In other words, like, like if the price changes by 1%, how much does quantity demanded will gonna change? So one thing to remember is, price elasticity of demand is technically negative because like price and quantity moves in the opposite direction, right? Yeah, recall that, like when price goes is up, like the quantity demanded, goes down. And when price goes down, like quantity demanded goes up, right? But economists like usually ignore the negative sign and uses like the absolute value. So when you say like elasticity is like 2 or like zero point 0.5 or something, we're usually talking about like absolute value. All right. Now, let's do like some technical part. How to calculate the price elasticity of demand, right? This is where students usually get a little nervous because like there is a formula, I know that, But don't worry, because the concept is actually more important than the math. So like we're gonna use like midpoint formula. And the formula we're gonna be simply the price elasticity of demand equals the price percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. So the key idea here is that we use percentage changes rather than actual changes. And this is because a change of like 10 units means very different things depending on where you started, right? If the quantity goes from like 10 to 20, that's huge. And if the quantity goes from, maybe 10,000 to like 10,010, like that could be like relatively tiny, right? So like percentage here will gonna allow us like to compare fairly and to calculate this percentage changes, we're gonna use the midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula over here, as you can see, it uses the average of like starting and ending values as the denominator. And this gives the same answer whether we move from point A to B or from point B to A. And that is the reason we're gonna use like this method a lot. Um, yeah. Now I brought a quick example. Let's practice. So suppose like price rises by 10% and quantity demanded falls by, 50%. Then what is the price elasticity of demand? Let's think about it like for maybe 30 seconds. So we just like learned that, right? So like price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price, right? So we simply divide 15% divided by 10%. That gives us like 1.5. So we're using, like absolute value. So elasticity equals like 1.5. Like, let's think about like what that means. Like, like quantity changed more than price changed. So like that means like consumers reacted, strongly. So one important thing you have to know over here is along the demand curve, price and quantity move in opposite direction. That gives like us like, minus negative value. And, like this is why elasticity is naturally negative. But in practice, we just, focus on absolute value. So, like whenever like you say about like elasticity, like you can say like negative 1.5, but also you can say that elasticity is like just 1.5, like which means same. So yeah. So whenever you're solving problems in this class, like don't panic if you get negative values. Like it is like, like so obvious, it's expected. So like just remember that we classify like elastic versus inelastic demand. We're usually like using the absolute value. So now we know like how to calculate, like elasticity. Now we're learning about like, more important concept of today's class. We're gonna talk about elastic and versus inelastic. Let's break demand into like three categories, like which is first elastic, second inelastic, and third unit elastic. So, elastic demand means like consumers are very responsive to the price change. So that means, a small change in price causes a larger percentage change in quantity demanded. So naturally, like, like logically thinking, like elasticity should be greater than one. So yeah, simple examples, we're gonna be probably luxury products. maybe vacation could be also like thinking as like, luxury products. So like if the price rises, people can easily, like cut back. And the second thing, we're gonna be inelastic demand. And inelastic demand means that consumers are not very responsive to the price change. So a large change in price causes only a small change in a quantity demanded, right? So like that means that like we're gonna have like elasticity less than one. And what could be the example? Maybe you know, like what else? What do we have? Probably like gasoline, like gas price. Like that is like kind of like necessity, right? And maybe we can think of like electricity or maybe prescription medicines, like something like that, which people still need these things even when the prices increase, right? Yeah. In that case, like we call it as like inelastic. And then lastly, like I want to talk about, like unit inelastic, which is the like middle case. So percentage change in a quantity equals like percentage change in price. So elasticity equals exactly one, like which makes sense, right? Then moves like, like perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic. So let's think of like some extreme cases. Like perfectly inelastic demand. Imagine like vertical demand curve. Like quantity never changes regardless of like price. So elasticity like equals zero. And this is like something rare in real life. But yeah, maybe a life-saving medicine with no alternative maybe comes close, I think. Yeah. So also like we do have like another version of it, which is called like demand is like perfectly elastic. So like this is like, like the case where we have like horizontal, like demand curve. So like which means that like a tiny, tiny little amount of like increase in price will gonna cause like, like quantity demanded to fall to the zero. So like in this case, we have like, elasticity as infinite. Again, like this is like very rare in reality, but most products like fall somewhere between these two extremes. So yeah, this will gonna be like variety of like demands curve, and I brought some like graphs over here. So let's see together. So like, all right, hold on. Yeah. So like these four figures are stand for each cases like we just like talked about. Like first one is like perfectly elastic, which has like horizontal demand curve as you can see. So I just like added up like some small like explanation at the bottom of the figure, like you can check it, but like I can also go over it. So like percent change in quantity is infinite for any percent change in like price. So which means that, like the quantity demanded is infinitely responsive to a change in price. So PD becomes like infinite. That is the meaning of like we have when we have like horizontal demand curve. So as you can see, it goes in that way. Second one is like elastic. So we have like relatively flat demand curve. So that means like percent change in quantity is larger than percent change in price. So we have like relatively small responsive like to the like a relatively a little bit larger response to a change in like price. And third one is like in elastic case, like we have like relatively steep demand curve. As you can see, like percent change in like one unit of like quantity is smaller than like percent change in like price. So we have like smaller than one PED and which has relatively small responsive to the like, change in price. The last case was also like extreme case, like which was like perfectly inelastic case. We have like vertical, like demand curve over there. So, you know, when a person change in quantity is zero for any person change in price, we have like exact like this type of like, like figure over there. And as you can see, like the quantity demanded is unchanged, not gonna change at all for any change in price. That is the reason we have like price of like elasticity of demand becomes like zero. All right, we just like looked it over. So I also wanna talk about like a little bit more about, like elastic versus inelastic. So, like surprisingly, like the same price change can produce very different quantity responses, right? Imagine true product like for maybe what we can bring. Maybe Starbucks and Cup of Joe. So for Cup of Joe, like a $1 price increases causes like sales to drop dramatically. Let's just suppose that. And for Starbucks, like the same like $1 increases like barely affect sales. Like like think about it. Like we have like lawyer, customers like for probably like probably Starbucks than Coffee Joe. So like even if like we have like same cha price change, we have like different buyer reactions. So like it will gonna lead us to have like different like elasticity. And this is why businesses like spend like a lot of money to study like, about like consumer behavior. So like if the consumers are highly responsive, again, like firm must be careful when they raise prices, right? That makes sense. If the consumers are not very responsive, firms have like power, so like they have like more flexibility about like, choosing their prices. So as you can see over there, like in a figure, the slope of a demand curve and elasticity are not exactly same thing. So a straight line demand curve has a constant slope, right? As you can see. But elasticity changes as you move along the curve. So like that's the most like advanced point, but it is like important to know. I just like, calculated like two different, of segment over there of like PED. As you can see, like we know like quantity change it like almost same, like, like their amount is like different. All right. So, like now, let's connect elasticity to something businesses like care deeply about, which is revenue, right? So, yeah, I don't think I've never mentioned this before, but total revenue equals price and quantity, which makes no sense, but very simple, right? The interesting question is like what happens to the revenue when the price changes, right? The answer depends on elasticity. Of course, nothing new, right? This is why elasticity is like so useful. So, yeah, let's think about it. So, if a company raises price, do you think, revenue always increases? Probably or probably not. Like, like it is not necessarily like increases. I brought two cases over there. We have like first case, like elastic demand curve, and second case was like inelastic demand curve. So like when we have like elastic demand curve, like if we increase the price, like it will gonna decrease the quantity a lot. So we have to like actually like, like calculate new revenue and like old revenue and like compare it to say we have, like larger revenue after the price off, right? And if the case is like, for the inelastic demand curve, probably there will gonna be like high possibility of like, like getting a larger revenue. That is because we have, like higher price, but like small decrease in quantity demanded. So that will gonna have like, like larger, like they're gonna like make firms to have like, higher revenue. So even if like the same rise in price causes like, total revenue to fall in the elastic case, but rise in the inelastic case, that you have to be like very mindful. Like if you don't know like that exactly, or like, like we only have like subtle changes like in price, I recommend you to like, calculate it and like compare it. That will gonna be more secure. But like in general, rise in price will gonna cause a fall, like, like smaller revenue in elastic case and, higher revenue in the inelastic cases. All right. So let's talk about the revenue a little bit more. So this slide contains like one of the most important relationship. I don't use that important thing a lot, but yeah, let's think carefully. So when price changes, like two things will gonna happen, right? So like price changes, of course, and quantity demanded will gonna changes in the opposite direction, right? And the questions like will gonna become like I was like talking about this like a little bit from the previous like slide, but yeah, the question will gonna become, which effect is larger. So yeah, so let's think about it. So suppose like demand is elastic, like customers react strongly, right? So that means like quantity demanded rises by a lot. So like the increase in sales outweighs the lower price. That is the reason like revenue rises. Similarly, like, like if the price rises, like quantity demanded falls dramatically, so revenue will gonna be fall. So like for elastic demand, price and revenue like move in opposite direction. Like that is the key. And now suppose like we have like inelastic demand, right? And we know that like consumers like don't react that much, right? So if the price rises, of course, quantity demanded falls only a little, the higher price like dominates, right? Um, then like revenue will gonna rises, like interestingly. So if the price falls, on the other hand, like quantity increases only slightly, so revenue gonna fall, and for in elastic case, price and revenue move in the same direction. And this is why some films can raise prices and still earn more money. So yeah, what example could be this case? Hmm, maybe. Yeah, let's say this. Why can airlines like sometimes like charge very high prices near holidays? Because, we know that like demand is relatively inelastic. That is the reason, right? Then why do like stores offer huge discount? Maybe on Black Friday, like or something like that. Because, they think demand is elastic enough that the increase in sales outweighs like the lower price. That is a thing. Like that is like kind of like the way of like films think. So like, oh, we're gonna be very helpful like you're interested in like, business thing as well. All right, our last slide is about like other demand elasticities. So like we just like learned about like price elasticity, right? But like like price elasticity is not the only elasticity economists we're gonna use. There are two other very important one. So we're going to talk about it. The first thing is like the cross price elasticity, which measures like, like how demand for one good responds to a change in the price of the other goods. So like it's kind of like thinking about like two different, goods. So like think about like Coke and Pepsi. So if Pepsi becomes like more expensive, like some people will gonna switch to the Coke. So these goods are substitutes. And substitutes like we're gonna have like positive like cross price elasticity like in most cases, which means that like the price of like one goes up, demand for the other will gonna rises. Like so they move in the like same direction. Now, let's talk about maybe burgers and burger buns. These are complements, right? They're kind of like, like complement each other. So in these cases, if the like price of like burger rise, like fewer burger buns will gonna be sold, that means, like fewer, burger buns are needed. So like typically, like complements have like negative like cross price elasticity. Yeah. And the second one, I want to talk is, income elasticity. And this measures like, like how demand responds to the changes in income. Let's think about it. Like, from my understanding, as people earn more money, what happened to the demand, right? Like typically they were gonna spend more. So like we call it as like normal goods. Like for normal goods, like demand will gonna rises. So like that is the reason we have like income elasticity is like positive. Like for example, like new electronics or new laptop or, like travel, like some sort of it. But there is also one thing called like inferior goods, which is, like kind of like opposite of like, normal goods. In and for, like inferior goods, like, like demands will gonna falls as income rises. Like income elasticity will gonna be negative, of course. Um, like examples might be some sort of what could it be? Oh yeah, very one example like will gonna be like instant noodles or very low cost transportation options. Yeah. Because like as people become wealthier, they often switch to alternative like they prefer. So I just like wanted to say that inferior good is some sort of like term for a product or service whose demand decreases when a consumer's income or real wealth rises. Cause, like instead of like, buying this like sort of like budget friendly items, like, like wealthier customers, we're gonna purchase like something more expensive, like something higher quality substitute, like something like that. So yeah, that is the reason we have like negative income elasticity because like demand moves like, opposite direction of income, as wealth goes up, consumption goes down. Yeah. But yeah, that is the thing of today. And yeah, let's wrap up today's session over here. Um, Today we learned that elasticity measures responsiveness and price elasticity of like demand tells us, how strongly customers, right, react to the price changes. And, we talked about like which case is elastic or inelastic or of course, like unit elastic, right? And elasticity is like extremely important because it determines, like how price changes affect total revenue. Once again, we learned like how to like calculate total revenue as well, like really quick, but like we learned. And finally, also we introduced like cross price elasticity and also income elasticity, which help explain, like how demand responds to other economic factors. So for the quiz, make sure you're comfortable with calculating elasticity, identifying elastic versus inelastic demand, understanding like how elasticity affects revenue, and distinguishing, like substitutes, complements of normal goods and inferior goods, and also about like, like market equilibrium part. So yeah, we'll continue building on like this idea and like learn about like elasticity of supply next class. So yeah, thank you for coming. I wish you the good luck and quizzes. Bye.